So it seems to me there is a homogenization of the world's news agenda. And that agenda is driven by people who actually profit from war. They actually do. Large arms companies, for instance. And so I'd be interested in hearing any ideas about this provocation that I introduced.
Earl Hanson?
I'm not here to defend or counter what you say, but what I would say is that large arms companies have been profiting from war for a good long time, and long before the current information revolution came about. So I'd be careful to not pin all the world's ills on something contemporary. False flag operations have been around Tonkin Bay, and I'm sure war historians would tell you about provocations through history. So the question in my mind is, how much is it becoming more pronounced? Is it becoming more accelerated? And I just don't know the answer, but something tells me that taking the long view would moderate our view. Where I actually completely agree with you is that in North America, at least, there is becoming a concentration in the ownership of the media, which is hugely troubling, and that the mainstream media are suffering everywhere. Today, the Guelph Mercury, a newspaper in my neighboring town, has announced it will be closing.
Wow.
So what will they be reading here on? You can guess. But at the same time, what do I do? What do many of you, I suspect, do when you have time to kill? Might you be scrolling your Twitter accounts? And I find I have access to, just because of the people I follow, I have access to a lot more variety of information than I used to by subscribing to the Globe and Mail, The Economist, and the Literary Review of Canada. So again, these are things where we can banter anecdotes. I think there's some hard-headed evidence that needs to be produced, but broadly speaking, I'm not convinced that in the last 25 years there has become a monopolization of information or knowledge sources at all. In fact, if you look at these global rankings of universities, the most striking thing is how Canadian universities, for example, and UK universities are less pronounced, and that universities in other parts of the world are creeping up those ranking scales. Now, we may question what that ranking is about and what values it represents, but I do think that where knowledge is produced is becoming much more diverse. We have what a colleague of mine calls a porous ecology of ideas, and that what is increasingly important isn't that ideas are produced in the West and transferred elsewhere, but that ideas can be produced anywhere in the world and are then adapted for anywhere else in the world. David had left IDRC by then, but my last president there, David Malone, often said that when he went around the world and asked, he didn't find people saying, we want to be like Norway, or we want to be like Canada. They'd say, we want to be like Singapore, we want to be like South Korea, we want to be like Chile. So there's lots of models out there, and there's lots of ways of getting to it. And I think that's the beauty of the world we find ourselves in right now, is that there's a real, in my view, diversity of ways to define progress and how we get there.
All right. Floor is open.
I'm sort of curious about that, your very last statement, because I'm wondering what are the metrics that we use other than economic data to measure progress? You know what I mean? That seems to be, like, if there's a form of homogenization, it seems to be related to a global market that provides a metric, right, which can be used to measure any country against any other, right, on a sort of equal scale. So I was sort of curious when you talked about that a couple different times. What are the other kinds of metrics, and where are they coming from?
happiness.
Correct.
I know
No,
groups that measure happiness, they interview communities, find out who's satisfied, independent of economics. Yes.
But in the development literature, is that part of it too?
I mean, you're right about the happiness thing, but guilty as charged. Yeah. You have per capita income, you could add to that things like, morbidity, mortality, education levels. You could certainly question each of those, but at the end of the day, most practitioners would want to boil those things down to numbers, and then, if not, how do you compare? And the only other metric left is what you said, what we call utility, or whether you call it quality of life or happiness. That's where the interesting work is going to take us.
Could I just, I thought somebody else would raise this, but just a few days ago, the Oxfam has come out with this report that 62 individuals own more than half of the world's wealth, and how does that jive, and what do you say, what is your position on something like the Oxfam report? And for all the diversity of opinion, how does that change the power dynamics? Or does it, when the wealth is getting more and more concentrated? And we talked about the people who pay for AI. Somebody pays for it. We talk about technology. It's not my technology. It's imposed on me. I had to buy new computers and spend a whole bunch of money because my favorite program has been declared obsolete, XP, and so I need to invest money I don't have in new technology, which is not as good as the old technology. So it's not to get off topic here, but I really would like to know where your stunning position on the increasing middle class, which is not sustainable, because as we well know from environmental literature, 5-6 Earths would have to do or maybe more to allow all of us to live like we do here, all of humanity. And by then we've destroyed the Earth several times over. So how do you counter that? What is your position on the Oxfam report?
I'm not going to defend the fact that 62 people.
Louder, please.
I'm not going to defend the fact that 62 people own half of the world's capital. I'm simply saying that there were a whole bunch of poor people, and let's not forget that 1 billion people came out of poverty in the last 20 years because of changes in the way the large developing countries organize themselves. Now, they went from there to there, and the rich went from there to there. So the world is more unequal. But I think there's room to disagree on the fact that if the large majority of people are better off, in some senses the world still is better off. Where I would agree with you is, have we now set in train a dynamic in which the inequality that has been created by the first mover takes all situation in technology, whether that's going to defeat this progress. And I'm just not qualified to answer that, so I don't have a position on that. But I'm simply not going to grant that those billion people who were living on $1 a day and now living on $2 a day will be living on $5 a day. And if you were living on $1 a day, I haven't had the misfortune to do that, but my sense is I'd rather be living on $2 a day.
That was actually my counter to this, is that if you, that may be true, I'll take your word for it, I don't actually have documentation for the billion people living actually much better than before, but is that due to the same processes as the process that is causing the wealthiest? So are these two different and maybe contradictory trends, and maybe they're countering each other, and maybe in another year Oxfam will come out with yet another report, and maybe they'll look at different aspects of the trends, because I think you could argue that there is, to address your point, that there's this international elite